Aloha, my name is Mark Anthony, and I'm elated to talk to you about React hooks. And the simple reason why is because React hooks make our lives as React app developers a lot easier. Class-based components, they are beautiful and they're able to create beautiful, responsive React applications, but functional hooks inside functional components allows you to do the same thing, but in more streamlined, kind of intuitive way. So, especially for us as app developers. So I'm excited to share an example that demonstrates a few hooks. But before I do, let's talk about what hooks are actually doing. They allow us to define and maintain and update stateful logic, but also, whenever the client interacts with our application, they allow us to respond to those with some special side effects. We can add a little razzle dazzle, some pizzazz, make our apps spicy, right? So let me show an example of an application that uses a few of these hooks. So I have here a standard single page application. I'm using React Router DOM. I'm using React Strap. This video is not really for those. But basically know that in my main app, I'm able to render different components based off my URL address. React Router DOM is allowing me to do that. So I'm going from the home component to the join class component and back and forth. So what kind of hooks do we have? We have several different kinds of hooks. We have useState. Sorry about that. We have useEffect. We have useRef and several more. These are there. You can even create a custom-based hook, right? For any eagle-eyed observer, I'm sure you could already tell that I'm using a hook inside my main application, right? I'm using useState right here. You want to call it at the top, and of course, you want to import it. Even before that, right? So at the very top, you're importing useState, and at the top of your function, you want to call your useState hook. So whenever we're dealing with state, there's two concerns that we have. We care about the variable and the value of that variable, but we also care about how do we change that variable. Otherwise, it's just like a static website, right? So we want to be able to update that variable. So we want the variable and we want a way to update that variable. And that's exactly what the useState hook allows us to do. It allows us to define a variable and the way we update the variable. For example, if we wanted to initialize the variable name, the way that we would create a method to update that name, we would just name it set name, right? So this is our naming convention. You take your variable and you just put the word set in front of it. So useState is letting us define course and then gives us a way to update that course whenever we need to in our variable. So how do we initialize the value of course? Well, course is initialized here as a string, as the string React, but we could also initialize it as a null, a number, an array of items, right? We can initialize it as an empty object, right? We can even initialize it as an object. In fact, that's what several folks decide to do, as long as it doesn't get really complicated. If it's a complex data structure, then you probably want to use useReducer, the useReducer hook. But useState manages simple objects very, very well, right? So I'm passing in an empty array object here to animate, and the way that I can update that is whenever I call set animate. So whenever it reads the value of course, it is reading the word React. But if I were to change this to, let's say, Tailwind, right? Well, now wherever it reads the word course, it is actually reading the value Tailwind, right? So that's why stateful logic is so important, because it's allowing us to pass information data between props. So am I able to update the course in my main app? No, but I do pass set course to my join class component. So let's head over there to join class. Let's run to the join class on my web app here. And I'm going to uncomment this out. I'm using Dropdown, which is a special Bootstrap component. And I'm trying to open up the Dropdown, but it's not working. That's because isOpen is set to false. Well, what if I change this to true? When I change it to true, oh, well, cool. Now it's open, but it's still not letting me accept that. And it's not letting me change it. And that's because we're dealing with a static value. We need to create state so that we can modify that state. So I'm going to write const, what is the variable that we're going to define? It's called isOpen, and we're going to define the way we update that variable as set isOpen, and we're going to use our useState hook here, and the initial value that we're going to pass it isn't a string. It's going to be false, because initially we want the drop down not to be open, right? We want it to be closed. So I passed it the is open variable, which I defined as false up here, but it's not working. That's because we need to be able to on click change that variable. Thankfully, drop down has a special property called toggle. So we're going to insert a function into this value, and the function that we're going to pass it is set is open. And now we have an opportunity to define, okay, what's the new value of is open? It's going to be the opposite of is open. So whatever is the current value of is open, define it as the opposite. So here, now it works perfectly, right? You can pass in a variable to set is open directly, but it's more preferable that you pass in a function that accepts the previous value of that variable as a parameter and then returns whatever you want the new value of the variable to be. So here I'm going to accept the previous value, and I'm just going to make it the opposite of whatever the previous was. And that's so, sometimes clients interact with it quicker than it's able to render, and so you might be dealing with a stale value. This helps to ensure when you pass in a function, it helps to ensure that you're dealing with the most recent version of that value. So still works, but it's not accepting the values that I have that I want when I click them. So I'm going to use my set course method, which was passed from my main app with these on clicks. And I'm going to pass it in going to run a function called set course, and I'm going to pass it in a string. So here I'm passing it in the HTML string, but of course, when they select different options, I want it to pass in a different string. So I'm going to change it to bootstrap. Here, I'm going to change it to tailwind. And here I will change it to React. Awesome. So when these items are clicked, now it is using the set course method that was passed to it to update whatever the course is. Here we're updating it to Tailwind. Here we're updating it to Bootstrap. Here we're updating it to jQuery. Fantastic. So that is the useState hook. Let's look at an example of useEffect. So I'm gonna open up this button really quick. Oops, give me one moment. I'm going to open up this button, and I'm going to go to the launch class page, and I'm going to open it up here in Visual Studio Code. And now we've got our useEffect. So what is useEffect for? useEffect basically allows us to run special side effects whenever our component renders, right? And you can actually modify it so that it isn't whenever our component renders, but it's whenever our component first renders, whenever it initially mounts on to the web application. And if you wanted to do that, instead of just passing in a function to useEffect, again, this function is whatever you want, is the item behavior that you want it to do when it renders. If you don't want it to do it on every render, then you pass it an empty array. This is actually called our dependency array. The reason why is that it is looking for variables that when they change, that's when it's going to update. And when you pass it an empty array, it's basically telling the component, hey, render this, use these effects only when it initially renders. So if I put in a value here, animate, for instance, it's going to break our web application. But if I put in the value animate, it's going to render this whenever animate as a variable changes. It's going to be watching it, checking to see if it changes. If it changes, okay, I'm going to run this effect. But there is nothing that we need to watch for. We're only going to add an event listener when it initially mounts onto our screen. So what event listener are we going to add? A mouse down. What's going to run when it mouses down? This mouse click. What happens when it mouse clicks? Whoa, the rocket ship takes off. Fantastic. We're already having a responsive website, right? So our useEffect is running because we were able to add an event listener. But let's check this out. If you're all going to do awesome and wonderful things. I installed a secret button here. When I click this button and I change pages, it's still listening to me. And that's because it still has an event listener. So if you want, you have to actually add a closer, you have to return a function that says, hey, let's make sure that we clean up after ourselves. You can't just add an event listener without removing it. Otherwise, it's going to listen to you. So when I rerun this website, when I enroll in class, now it'll work that one time. But when I change pages, it will, it's still following me. But check it out, it won't follow me after that. Okay, cool. This has been an awesome video. I've enjoyed being able to share useState, useEffect information with you. I hope to see you next time for some more class materials. Have a good rest of your day. Take care.